Again, everyone should trust that God can rescue them from times of trials for these three reasons. Jesus did not fear the storm, right? Jesus was in the same storm as the disciples, but he had the sense of peace that we can all have if we have the same relationship with the Father as he had, the sense of complete trust in the Father. Second, Jesus rebuked the disciples' faith. There was something that they did that demonstrated to Jesus that their faith was incomplete. And then third, Jesus amazed the disciples. So let's start with Jesus did not fear the storm. In Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 36, and there's several of the Gospels mention this story. Again, if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, for example, the Synoptic, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're very similar to one another. They talk about similar stories. They talk about similar sermons. They don't always have them in the same order because they weren't as interested in chronological order as we are in modern times. They were just like, Jesus talked about all these things. He talked about this. He talked about that. He talked about all these things. They didn't necessarily put them all in the same order. Now, that's not a contradiction. That wasn't their emphasis. But John is just, I love John. He's so different from the other three. He's like, I'm going to write my own gospel, and it's going to be totally different. Now, of course, it focuses on the big points, like Jesus' death and resurrection. But John tells a very different story than the other three. But this story is found, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John also talks about the walking on water, I believe, in John chapter 6 or 7. Don't quote me on that. But anyways, so each of them are going to tell the story. The reason why we're focusing on Mark is he's a little more detailed in the story, so we'll focus on his account rather than Luke and Matthew's. It says, "And the same day when the even was come," right, when it's evening, "he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship, and there were also with him other little ships." Now, early on in Mark chapter 4, it talks about this idea that Jesus is preaching to a multitude, and apparently he's on a shore, I believe it's Capernaum, and he gets into a boat so that the crowds can surround on the side of the sea or the side of the lake, and so he's already in a boat. And Mark is kind of giving that detail, saying, they take him in the boat, which he was already in the boat. Luke gives a little bit more of a summary of it. He just says, "Now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples, and he said unto them, Let us go over to the other side of the lake. And they launched forth." So Luke gives a little bit more summary. But Mark also mentions little ships. And later on, he's going to mention Jesus laying down on a pillow. And these are details that Luke and Matthew don't really mention. It's not contradictory, right? It's complementary. Where one gospel doesn't give all the details, the other gospel makes up for it by giving more details. But why would Mark give these details? Well, Mark was not a disciple of Jesus. Matthew was, John was, but Luke and Mark were not actually disciples of Jesus. So how did they get this information? Now, Mark, it's possible that he was around. We know from this story, at least, that there were other little ships. Maybe Mark was in one of those. But we also know that Mark, if it was John Mark, the same person who accompanied Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, he eventually left Paul and Barnabas, and he kind of paired himself with Peter. And so church tradition tells us, in other words, early people in the church, they tell us that Mark was he learned the information from Peter. So Peter would have been in this story. He would have known certain details, like there were little ships around, like that that Jesus was laying his head on a pillow, things like that. So when we read these things, we might look at them and say, that's not very important to the story, but it makes us realize that this was a real story, right? These are real details, and Mark is just recording those things. All right, and like I said, the other little ships, they don't really play a role in the rest of the story. It's possible that the other disciples, some of them were in those ships, and so maybe as they're crying out to Jesus, they're also crying from the other ships, but it doesn't specify that. All right, and there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. And he, talking about Jesus, was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? All right, Mark 4:37-38. All right, several things to unpack here. First off, they're on the lake. This is probably the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias. It's a very big lake, so they would often call it a sea. And as they're trying to travel to the other side, a great wind comes, and it's terrifying them. Even though many of these were fishermen who were used to being on this lake, they're terrified of this storm. And the waves are getting so big, they're filling up the boat. And Jesus is asleep in the boat, and they're crying out to him, saying, "Don't you care about us?" And likely a rhetorical question. I meant to look up the word. I'm so sorry. I looked it up before, and I wanted to verify the word because I read it from someone else. But the word master here, it's kind of like the word teacher. In the other Gospels, they refer to him as Lord and stuff like that. In this gospel, I believe the term there is a little less formal, more of a term that they may have used like rabbi or something like that. You can look that up if you would like. But Mark is trying to emphasize their panic, this idea that they're kind of doing away with formalities, and they're coming to Jesus, trying to wake him up, saying, "Don't you care? Look at what's going on around us. The ship is full of water, or the boat is full of water." And Jesus, he wakes up. But before we get to that, let's compare this story to the story of Jonah. Jonah was not like Jesus, right? They were both prophets, if you will. But there's a big difference between Jonah and Jesus. Jonah followed God when God told Jonah to do something Jonah already wanted to do, right? When God said to Jonah, "I want you to preach prosperity to that wicked Israel," Jonah's like, "Okay," right? But when he said, "I want you to preach my message to Nineveh," the enemy of Israel, he said, "No way, Jose," right? He wants to go the opposite direction. He wants to get as far away from God and his people as he can so that God won't convict him anymore. So he starts heading in the opposite direction of Nineveh. And God's not going to let this happen. Now, even though Jonah was going against God's will, was trying to go against God's will, Jesus was not. So that's where they contrast quite a bit. But because Jonah was trying to go against God's will, God sends a great storm on the sea. Just like, again, that's not what happened with Jesus, but there was a great storm. But the King James Version is an awesome version, often very poetic, very beautiful, tries to capture the emotion of the language of Hebrew. But in this case, I think it almost underemphasizes the intensity that they're trying to say. It says, "But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken." Now, in the Hebrew, which I don't know enough Hebrew to quote this, but even the words that they used, they had a rhythm to it, to where it sounded like ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, right? This idea that they're using this technique of trying to emphasize the storm and how it's so intense. And when it talks about the Lord sent, the word there is actually the same word for throwing a javelin. This idea that God took this wind and thrust it at the sea, right? This intensity, and it talks about the ship is like to be broken, but in the Hebrew, what it does is it anthropomorphizes. That's a hard word to say. I was planning on practicing that term, but I still can't get it. It means it gave them like a personality, right? Hebrew prophetic books are very often very poetic. In fact, if you read Jonah chapter 2, very poetic. It's a poem. But they will often use metaphor and will give intensity to it by making something inanimate like a storm or something like a ship and give it like a human personality, and saying that the ship is threatening to tear itself apart. So we already have this intensity of God thrusting a storm at Jonah. We have this intensity of the ship acting like a person saying, "I'm going to tear myself apart." And all of this is to emphasize that God has control over the storm. God has control even over the vessel that Jonah is trying to use to run away from God. And it says, "Then the mariners," right, the sailors, "were afraid and cried every man unto his God." Remember what the disciples did. They were afraid of this storm. They were used to sailing, but there was something about this storm that terrified them. And they cried out to Jesus, who ironically is their God. So very similar in that sense. "And cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. So the shipmaster," right, the captain, "came to him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not." So very similar in the sense that both Jonah and Jesus, they're asleep in the ship for different reasons. A storm comes, and the sailors, they're terrified of this storm. They recognize that there's, excuse me, that's what this is for. They recognize that there's something supernatural going on. And so the sailors, oh, that's pretty good actually. Did you put a lot of honey in it? Yeah, there we go. That's why. But they're terrified of the storm, and they're crying out to their God. And, of course, the disciples are crying out to Jesus. Do you even care about us, they say. But let's see how Jesus responds. It says, and he arose, talking about Jesus, and rebuked epitomao, the wind, and said unto the sea, peace, be still, phemao. And we'll get on to more of that. But just imagine Jesus is stepping out, or he's waking up. He's getting up in a ship that's full of water, and he just stands up and he rebukes the storm. He rebukes the wind and tells it, shut up, right? Imagine a Jesus alarm clock, right? Boom, 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 right? Hits the snooze button. But what's interesting here, why did he rebuke the wind? Now, it could be very similar to the story of Jonah in the sense of anthropomorphizing, where you're giving something a personality even though it's an inanimate object. But could there be something behind this storm? And this is speculation, so I want to emphasize this. But in Mark chapter 1, it says, and there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, right? A demon-possessed man. And he cried out, saying, let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked epitomao, him, saying, hold thy peace, phemao, which is the exact same words he uses here. So some have speculated that maybe there were demonic forces behind this storm. And regardless of if there was or there wasn't, the big emphasis is that Jesus had peace during the storm. He wasn't afraid of the storm. Now, he could rebuke the wind, whether there were demonic forces behind it or not. He had control over nature, which is, of course, another big emphasis here. But it is interesting to think, was there something going on that was intended to make the disciples doubt, the spiritual warfare going on around them, and Jesus recognized it and he rebuked it and told it to shut up, just like he did in Mark 1:23-25. It says, peace, be still, and the winds ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? Right? And Jesus is revealing something to us that sometimes, at least in this case, fear is the opposite of faith. Not all the time, but in this case, Jesus is making it very clear, you demonstrated a lack of faith by your fear. And how often do we do that when we freak out about things? Last week, I talked a little bit about, trusting Jesus, even when he doesn't do the things that you want. But isn't it easy to panic when things go wrong? James is here today. Where is James? There he is. James can testify. That man is a man of faith. I don't want to promote him completely, right? This is a house of God, not a house of James. But I was at his house. He had asked me to come over and help him with something with the wheel. I'm not a mechanic. I don't know why you called me. But Burl was also there, and he's much more of a mechanic. That guy can help you build planes. So don't ask him to fix your car. It might start flying, right? But we were over at his house, and we're trying to take the wheel off, and there's more to it than that. And like I said, I'm not a mechanic, but he brought me there for my strength, right? That's what I'm assuming. And we're not able to fix it. And he's got work that he's got to get to, and he needs the vehicle so that he can get there. But the mechanic is telling him, or the tow truck is telling him, we can't transport it until later. And then the mechanic is saying, well, I need it now, or else I can't fix it by the time you need it. And I'm talking to James, and I said, I got a friend who owns a vehicle dolly. What's that called? A truck dolly? Anyways, it's one of those things where you can drive it up on top of it and you can transport it. I said, maybe we can do that, or maybe we can get a tow cable, or maybe it'll last long enough for you to get to the mechanic because it was something weird with the wheel. And I'm trying to figure out how are we going to get this where it needs to go. And James just says, don't worry about it, brother. God's got this. And I'm like, all right. And I start driving home, and James calls me while I'm driving home, and he says, you'll never believe it. Or I don't know that he said that, but he said, guess what? The tow truck called. They said they're on their way. And I'm like, my goodness, look at that man's faith. And again, it's not promoting you, James. It inspired me. This idea that I was panicking, not even for my own problem, but for your problem, right? I was panicking, thinking, how can I fix this when I should have been looking for, like James was, how can God fix this? And God was working in that moment, and I showed a lack of faith in God in that moment, and I apologize for that. But how often do we do that? When trouble comes to us, we start panicking. If you feel like maybe your relationship is in shambles, right? If you feel like your relationship is in shambles and you're like, oh my goodness, what can I do to fix this, instead of trusting the God who can fix it? When your job is in trouble, you think, what can I do to fix this, when it's the God who can fix this? And the fear that we sometimes show is not a testimony of the God who we trust, but is a testimony of our own inability to do things. And so Jesus looks at his disciples who are panicking, who are freaking out. It seems like the end for them, right? The water is filling up their boat. I'm not an expert on boats, but I'm pretty sure that makes them sink. And so they're freaking out. If it is the Sea of Galilee, this thing is like 600 feet deep. And swimming, I'm sure they can swim, but it's not exactly a recreational sport there. So they're probably going to struggle to swim to shore, especially during a storm. They're thinking, this is the end. Does Jesus even care about us? And we often put God in that same point of view. We look at him during our hard times. We say, God, what are you doing? Do you even care about me? And that's what they showed. And that's why Jesus looked at them and he says, why did you fear? Do you not have faith? What was Jesus doing? He was sleeping. Now, it's possible that Jesus was very exhausted. We know that this was the evening. So it's possible that he had been preaching all day and he's exhausted, both maybe socially, both physically from talking. When I preach, maybe I don't show it, but I'm exhausted afterwards. I go home, or sometimes I don't go home. I go to like my parents' house where we eat dinner as a family, or today I'm going to someone else's house. But I'm just like, oh, just dragging my feet. I am so grateful to be here, right? And maybe I am, but I'm exhausted. So maybe Jesus, who had been preaching all day, he may have been exhausted. But regardless, Jesus was not caught by surprise from this storm. He likely knew that this was going to happen, and yet he's like, I'm just going to take a nap. And may I say this? I imitate Jesus this way, right? When trouble comes, I'm like, I'm going to go take a nap. And I don't know if that's what Jesus said or Jesus meant when he's talked about imitating him, or when Paul talks about imitating him. But I'm all for imitating him that way. But Jesus had so much trust in God, and it's hard to talk about the faith of Jesus, right? Because it's like, did Jesus have faith? He was one with God. What did he have to believe when he had such a relationship with God that he didn't believe he was real? He knew he was real. Can we have that relationship? Maybe not the same that Jesus has, right? Jesus is one with God. But can we grow ever so close to God that there is no doubt in our mind who he is, that he exists, and that he loves us? Can we have that relationship? Oh, Pastor Mark Driscoll, I don't know him very well. I've never met him, actually, so I don't know him at all. But I know about him, and he was teaching a sermon, and maybe he's a great guy, maybe he's not. I don't know him that well. But he was teaching a sermon, and he talked about this idea of children staying close to dad, right? And he said if the child stays close to their dad, they know that they're safe, right? They feel the sense of protection. But if they wander away from dad, they don't have that sense of protection anymore, and they might panic. How many times do we wander away from God and we go our own way, and we panic when trials come because we don't see where dad's at, right? In the same sense, they were panicking because they didn't have the same peace that Jesus had because of his relationship with the Father. He knew the Father. He knows the Father. And he has such confidence in the Father that he could take a nap during a storm. And yet he looks at his disciples who freaked out and he said, "Have you no faith?" Going back to, we already did that one. Jesus amazed the disciples. It says, and they feared exceedingly. The word feared here, I mean, you know what the word feared means. In the other Gospels, it talks about they were amazed by Jesus. And that's not necessarily a contradiction. You can be amazed and fearful at the same time. But there was my mind went blank. Oh, I hate it when that happens. I'm going to take a drink till I have time to think about what it was. Nope, still gone. All right. I was watching recently Little House on the Prairie. Who's ever seen or heard of Little House on the Prairie? You may have even read the books. I didn't know there were books until I started watching it again. But my favorite character in that show is Nelson Olson. That guy, just love him to death. But he's the store merchant. He's married to a wicked, wicked woman, or just a horrible woman, and has horrible children. But he's just such a nice guy that I'm just like, I love this guy. But anyways, there's a fighter coming to town, and is a professional boxer, and he's been boxing since he was a kid, or he's been fighting since he was a kid, and his children, who are kind of mean, and they're trying to compete with Laura Ingalls and saying, "My dad's braver than your dad," or whatever, and so they said, "You have to fight him," right? And Mrs. Olson, she's like, "Oh, Nels, he was a champion boxer," and he's like, "Yeah, that's right." And they're like, "Oh, well, you're so small," the son says. He says, "Oh, it's not about size, son. It's about speed," and he's doing all this stuff, right? And the son's like, "So you think he couldn't even hit you?" He's like, "Oh, couldn't even lay a punch on me." And the wife goes, "I have a great idea. You should fight him." Right? And anyway, so he shows up, and he's waiting for the stagecoach because he knows this fight is going to come out. And out walks this kind of small man who's limping, and he's like, "Oh, thank goodness." And then after him, turns out that was the manager. After him comes out this big, probably 6'8" guy, mean looking, and you can just see Mr. Olson. And he is both amazed and terrified, right? Terrified at this man who he thinks could tear him in pieces. Mr. Olson did not win that fight, by the way. But anyways, that's a spoiler if you do happen to watch that episode. So it's not a contradiction to say, for one gospel to say that they were amazed at his faith, and another gospel to say that they were not amazed at his faith, amazed at what he did, and also fearful at what he did. But I remember what I was saying now. So in the story of Jonah, Jonah he's so much against going and doing what God has told him to do. We know that God sent the storm because he was disobeying him, right? He was going the opposite direction of what God told him to do. So God sends this storm, and the mariners, these sailors, they figure out that Jonah's the problem. They figure out that it's his God who has sent this storm, and they're thinking, "All right, Jonah, you're a prophet of this God. What are we supposed to do?" And he tells them, not turn the ship around, which probably would have done it, but rather throw me overboard. And now this puts the sailors in a bit of a predicament, because they're thinking, well, if we don't throw him overboard to his death, then his God's going to take us down with him. If we do throw him overboard to his death, we just killed the prophet of Israel, the prophet of this God, and we murdered him because he hasn't faced any trial, and he might hold his blood against us. So right before they throw him overboard, they're like, "God, please, show mercy on us. We're just doing what we think we're supposed to." And they just kind of push him overboard or whatever. And as soon as he's overboard, the sea calms. And they are amazed. And it says they feared with a great fear, right? They feared exceedingly, just like the disciples. They saw the power of God in action. And it grew their faith. So they were both amazed and fearful, just like the disciples were. They said, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" You see, when they went out in the ship, They were following the command of their teacher. But as they were leaving the ship, they realized this was no mere teacher, right? This was someone who had the power over not just to heal people, right? There were other healers back then, or at least people who claimed to be healers. There were locations like the pool of Bethesda, I believe it was, where people thought they could go and they could be healed. So the idea of Jesus healing was very miraculous, but he wasn't the only one who claimed that, right? He was certainly a great healer, but when he showed power over creation itself, that spoke volumes to who he was. This was not just a healer. This was the creator, the one who had power over creation. So when he turned water into wine, or he calms the seas, these are extra important miracles that we need to pay attention to. Certainly, raising the dead back to life is an awesome miracle, shows his power over life, but these are also awesome miracles. And it's likely that when Mark was writing this gospel, he had this psalm in mind. It says, "They that go down to the sea in ships, that do," this is from Psalms 107, verses 23 through 29, "that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heavens. They go down again to the depths. Their soul," talking about the sailors, "their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like drunken men, and are at their wits' end. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm to calm, so that the waves thereof are still." So when he's presenting this story, he's not presenting it as Jesus is just another great healer. He's presenting it as Jesus has the power of God over creation. Just as only God can calm the storms, Jesus is calming the storms. So just as, there's several different things we can learn from this. But again, the conclusion to this is that everyone should trust that God can rescue us from times of trials for these three reasons. Jesus did not fear the storm. Jesus had so much confidence in God that throughout this storm, he was able to take a nap. We were in men's group on Tuesday night, which if you're a man, I encourage you to go to. But on Tuesday nights, there was one of the lessons that we went over was the story of Abraham. And after Abraham had been told by God that, hey, I'm going to bless you, right? I'm going to make you a great nation. And same chapter, Abraham has to go to Egypt because there's a famine in the land that he's at. And so he goes to Egypt, and Abraham starts protecting himself, right? He tells everyone, Sarah, I know she's beautiful. She's not my wife. Don't kill me, right? So Abraham starts trying to protect himself rather than trusting God to protect him. The God who had just promised him, I'm going to make you a great nation. Now, later on, Abraham's faith does grow. And when God says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation through Isaac, I want you to sacrifice Isaac, right? That's kind of confusing. But in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, it explains that a little bit. It explains that Abraham had so much faith in God's promises that he believed God would raise Isaac from the dead because God had promised, through Isaac, I'm going to make you a great nation. And Isaac didn't have any children. So if Isaac was going to die, then the only way God could keep his promises is to raise Isaac back from the dead. So Abraham's faith did grow, but we know early on that even after God had promised, saying, I'm going to make you a great nation, Abraham, instead of trusting God to protect him in Egypt, he trusted himself and his own abilities. And he lied to or at least he misled the Pharaoh in Egypt. But we look at Jesus, and Jesus doesn't have to lie, right? Jesus doesn't have to try to trick people into keeping himself safe. He has so much confidence in God. In fact, when there were times when they're trying to stone him, and the Bible reveals it wasn't his time yet, right? He knew what was going on. He knew what was coming, but he knew even during the disasters that were happening, he's like, this is not my time. And let me tell you something. We each have a time where this life will be done. And for those who are believers, that's a glorious, now that the journey may not be glorious, but the end result is glorious. We're all going to heaven, and that's awesome. But Jesus had so much confidence in God, knowing that this is not my time, and he could sleep through the storms. And I want to encourage you not to take naps all the time, though that's probably healthy. But take time to think about when you're going through the trials, what is God trying to do in this? Will I show faith by being confident in God's ability to protect me? Or will I show fear and skew the testimony that God is trying to produce in me? When I was 14 years old, my sister passed away. And it was a very difficult time for my family. And I was very, very fortunate to already be very founded in my relationship with God. And he helped me through the situation to the point where people would come to me, other teenagers, right? I'm just a kid. Other teenagers would come to me and they say, Daniel, how did you do it? Right? How did you handle that so well? And I didn't think I handled it well. But they would come to me and say, how did you continue to have faith in God? How did you grow through that experience when, for me, it would tear me apart if my sister passed away? We were just a couple years apart. And I told them, I said, God helped me through it, right? And I'm not saying that I'm perfect, but at that moment, God was glorified, right? Not because of what I did, but because of what he did for me. And all I did was tell people what he did for me. When we go through times of trial and we have confidence in God and we have a peace during those trials, people notice those things. People notice a difference. And they look at you and they say, what's different about them? Why do they have a peace during this time and I don't? I remember when COVID was happening, everyone was panicking. Now, we were often being reassuring each other, as Christians, we can have confidence during this time. And I think Christians were a fairly good testimony during that time, but there were also times that even the Christians struggled to trust God during that time. And all around the world through this pandemic, people were very fearful. But imagine if when you go through hard times, whether it's a loss of a job, loss of a relationship, a loss of life, not your life, but someone else's life, loved ones, whenever you go through these hard times, if you can continue to have confidence in God, knowing that God is trying to do something great in your life, you can have such a testimony for him where they can look at you and say, why weren't you fearful? Why did you have so much faith? And how can I have that amount of faith? And you can have an opportunity to point them to Jesus. So Jesus had peace during the storm. Second, Jesus rebuked the disciples' faith because their fear was the opposite of the faith that Jesus wanted them to have. And then third, Jesus amazed the disciples. Again, they looked at Jesus and they thought, I thought I went in this boat with a man, but what kind of a man can calm the sea? Right? They realized, they came closer and closer to understanding this is not a mere man. This is the Son of God. This is the man with God's power. Right? Remember the centurion that we talked about last week. He didn't just believe Jesus was a healer. He believed Jesus had the power of God, the authority of God over the spiritual realm. All right, let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I want to thank you for this day. Lord, we're so grateful for these stories. Lord, truth is, I don't want to be in a storm. I'm not that great of a swimmer. I can only imagine those disciples who may have even been better swimmers than me, struggling, thinking this is the end. All their hopes and dreams of this Messiah that they were following, thinking it's all done. Everything we'd hoped for is all gone. We're going to die here. And does Jesus even care? But Lord, you used that story as an example to us all, not just to grow their faith, but to grow our faith, so that we can understand that even during those trials, you're still with us, that we can have confidence in you. Lord, there may come a day when you don't save us, where we go through those hard times. And Lord, I pray that especially during those times that we would trust you all the more. Lord, I think of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who confidently said, our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, Lord, may we have that same confidence so that Jesus can look down from heaven and say, not that, why are we so fearful, but be amazed at our faith, just like he was amazed at the centurion's faith. Lord, please grow us. Right now, we're all broken, and for the rest of our lives, we're going to be broken. But Lord, bring us ever closer to completeness in our relationship with you. Lord, we love you, we praise you, we thank you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.